All right, perfect. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for taking time out of your day, your most valuable resource, and spending it here today. My name, for those of you who don't know me, is Dr. Jeff Donaldson. I am as a full-time job, a principal researcher at Preparedness Labs Incorporated, which is a Canadian research and education firm into preparedness. I'm also associate faculty at Royal Roads University in their disaster and emergency management program. I'm also a proud founding member of the International Social Capital Association and the pilot and current official steerer of the special interest group for disaster resilience. And so the roadmap of what we're going to talk about today is a quick orientation of the special interest group, why we've created it, why it's here, a bit of talk about social capital theory, some challenges in emergency management, talk a bit about preparedness, what it is and why do people listen, and then talk about the strategy that I've been working on about how to use network identification and mapping societal institutions as a way of identifying pathways for passage of emergency preparedness communications. So the SIG was created several months ago, and the idea is we believe there is a need for a forum of choice for interested parties, experts, practitioners, academics, researchers, politicians, all to discuss the role of relationships within emergency management. There are a lot of spaces out there where people can provide lectures, can provide updates to their research, but we really need to create a space where all of us who are involved to some degree have an online virtual forum where we can all gather together and we can talk about issues of the day. And those issues are going to change. They're going to ebb and flow, but we need to have a place where people who are executing the task of emergency management can have casual but important discussions with the people who are researching or teaching in emergency management. And we think this is an incredible place and a great opportunity. And the Mighty Networks platform within the International Social Capital Association is what we use. And we have a link into the chat. It's free to sign up. It doesn't cost you any money. And it's a place where we can all come together and we can put our ideas and we can debate online in a forum that is distinct and different from our standard social media environments. It's a place where we all can bring the colleagues together to build resilience. And I don't need to inform anybody on this call or listening on YouTube that this is the age of disruption. So if we're going to talk about resilience, I think it's important to define it. Now, the definitions in most social science fields are pretty significant minefields. When I did my dissertation several years ago, I found no less than 32 distinct published peer-reviewed definitions of resilience. It's going to mean a little bit different to each other. This is what I use and operate on. It's basically X's ability to absorb and recover from an exogenous shock. An exogenous shock being something that is beyond your control. You didn't initiate it. You can't control the progress of it, and it's impacting how you're living your life. And my argument, and continues to be my position, is that resilience is principally built through relationships. But I think another great thing that we can do here at the SIG and an important avenue to pursue is the operationalization of social capital theory. And what that means is moving beyond the literature, taking and creating practical applications of the theoretical frameworks, basically a translation of the academic articles to on-the-ground impact. Now, our academic articles are important. They're foundational pieces of our discipline in our field, and that needs to be continued to be published, but we need to be able to translate that to a useful product for individuals who are working on the ground, and executable, if you will, to build models for better understanding the phenomena that the people on the ground are dealing with. But I think important to first talk about a couple of quick challenges in emergency management. None of this should be a surprise, but I think it's important to note in the space that we're in today. Preparedness communications, whether you look at data from Canada, data from the United States, data from the European Union, or overseas, for the most part, the public is not paying attention to the information that we are handing out. They're not adopting the preparedness behaviors that we include in our regular messaging. We have a loss of institutional trust. From the pandemic, irrespective of how you believe that was handled, all of the data that we have in the research studies point to the fact that the general population at the macro level has a fall in the institutional trust. We face resource allocation. There's always calls for investment in emergency management, but at least here in Canada, you compete with childcare, healthcare, education, and all of these other important government elements. And I think it's fair to say that if any more resources come to emergency management, it'll be token money. And there's going to be no significant investment because on the priority level, we're just not that high. One thing we don't talk about enough, and I think we should, is population relevancy. Obviously, everybody on this call and listening thinks that emergency management is a relevant part of society. But does society think so? Does society see you as a relevant arm of the government? Because if that's where our strategic power comes from and we're not deemed relevant and losing institutional trust, that loses future support for emergency management. But I think this is the one that makes me laugh all the time, is the preparedness gap. There is a significant gap between what the population believes emergency management is capable of doing and the capacity they have to execute that task versus reality. And we see that a lot when significant events happen. There is a gap between what the population wants EM to be able to do and what they're able to do. And somehow, unless we get ahead of that, that turns into a failure and a loss. And that's not the type of idea that we want to frame. But when we talk about preparedness, we have to kind of discuss what it is. And this is an important piece that I'll spend a bit of time on. Is, for me, I generally define it as pre-event decisions that influence the ability to navigate exogenous shocks. Back to the exogenous shock, something happened beyond your control. You cannot influence its progress. It impedes your ability to operate your normal life, but all of the decisions you made, either cognitive decisions or physical actions you took pre-event, are influencing your ability, positive and negatively, to deal with it. But the question we face when you're talking about preparedness communications is, how do you define a prepared individual? If I was to put an avatar on the side of my office here, or one was to park in front of you, and I was to ask you, describe what a prepared individual is, would you describe that as a person who has a set of capabilities, which means they have the ability to execute a set of tasks? Or would you say that's a person who has the following list of possessions? There is a cadre of people out there that believe if somebody has a certain set of possessions, they by default then become prepared, right? I'm not going to answer that question, but we have to understand how to define a prepared individual, because how do we measure it, the preparedness level, if we're unable to define what a prepared individual is? And then how do we prescribe a communication strategy to meet an identified shortfall if we can't first define what it is? So again, this is an example of operationalizing the theoretical frameworks in preparedness peer-reviewed articles into something we can use on the ground. And it simplifies into, first we have to define it, however you want to define preparedness, a prepared individual. And for example, if you're the emergency manager for the city of Mississauga, Ontario, and you have to be able to define, if I put one of my citizens against the wall, how do I define the prepared? I have to measure it to find out what their current level is versus the state that I want them to be in. I then have to develop a communication program that encourages them to adopt the behaviors I want. I then have to return and measure to make sure as to whether my communication strategy has increased the adoption of the behaviors. And then I have to rinse and repeat. And those of you that have ever been to business school, you understand I just explained Marketing 101. And this book that you see on the screen here is literally my most favorite textbook or guide on how to use social marketing for public emergency preparedness. It's written by Professor Nancy Meyer Emmerich. It's available on Amazon. I don't have a QR code. I don't get a discount on it. I don't get affiliate marketing. I just think it's an incredible piece of work. It's not a long write, which is why it's really great. And it has all kinds of wonderful information for people doing it. But then we got to think about, if we think about that, why do people listen? And if we look at the sociological research, anthropological, when you look at public administration data, public policy doctrine, individuals turn to trusted sources in times of crisis. I think everybody can agree to that. But what is a trusted source? It's generally has to require a pre-event relationship established. It has to provide some part of value or facts in the past to the individual. It's usually continuous, but it may be infrequent, but there's usually important exchanges between the person. The key note of this, of what the research tells us, is individuals define trusted sources, not the state. The state is not in a position to define what is or is not a trusted source of information. And for individuals, that's family, friends, faith, community, and sectorial advocates. And if we look at it that way, we start to understand that society is actually a set of networks, a set of pre-established relationships that express this sense of connectedness, our sense of belonging, our sense of place, our norms of reciprocity, and our predispositions to cooperate. These trusted networks, therefore, then would equal a higher message trust. And if that's true, how do I identify networks within society? Well, I'm going to rob a theory here from my 20 plus years as an Army officer called intelligence preparation of the battle space. And before a military group conducts an operation in a new location, they have the responsibility to identify everything they need, everything they could possibly know about the new location. So they have to require there's blue essay, red essay, green essay, yellow essay, white essay. They all represent some part of different situational awareness, whether it's the ground, the terrain, the transport patterns, the weather, the climate, the cultural, the population, the density, the housing, the services, the utilities, the 10 sectors of critical infrastructure. All of this data, the military members have to understand and digest it to get a picture of the space in which they're going to operate. The theory that I'm building and I'm going to produce and publish in May of 2024 is intelligence preparation of the disaster space. So I'm translating that into a methodology that can be used at the municipal level for doing that same type of intelligence gathering by the municipal emergency manager. Because let's be frank, most of them have one, maybe 1.5 human beings working for them, and they're serving a population of 500,000. The end result of this is to become intimately understand the environment in which you operate. So if we just want to take a 10,000 foot look at it to begin with, we think society is comprised of 4 spheres, a number of sectors that are all interconnected. And now it does depend whether you look at the different types of social science literature that I talked about, but generally we can agree that there are 4 spheres in society. Family is sometimes labeled civil society. Government is sometimes called the public sector. Business is sometimes called the corporate sector or private enterprise. Not profit in some models is broken into 2, one membership model, one non-membership model. But generally, all of us as we operate in society, we sit in one of those spheres, and we likely operate in all 4 at one time or another, or somewhere on that Venn diagram, you can find yourself and your organizations for which you belong. But on the right-hand side, you'll see sectors. Now, I just pulled out 15 here. And if you think these are separate and distinct sectors that comprise society. Now, some literature takes it up to 31 or 32 different sectors, depending on how you keep diving down into these. But if you think of each one of these sectors as an important structural element of the society you serve, you then break it down into something we call sectorial mapping. And I just pulled out secondary education as an idea here. And then you see you start to identify the key principal organizations that are involved in it. And just for an example, secondary education, you have unions. And now that could be, if you're in the province of Ontario where I am, that could be 4 to 6 separate unions involved in secondary education. Parent-teacher associations, you have the trustees, then you have the school board as well. And all of these are important actors within the sector of secondary education that operates within one of the 4 spheres of society. When you map it out, there's a methodology to it, because it's easy for me to sit here and say, just go map everybody that exists in society. And again, we roll back to the fact that that's not very helpful for the people on the ground when there's 1 or 1.5 people working an emergency management center. So we look at beginning with advocacy groups. And so this mirrors the literature on bonding social capital, which is a high degree of homogeneity. So people that have really tight, strong bonds, and very common. If you think about the Catholic Church diocese, for example, let's go to the city of Calgary, Alberta. There may be 10 Catholic churches. Do you need to speak to the 10 Catholic churches? Or if you identify the diocese, you then by network have access to all of the Catholic churches. There's also coordinating organizations that exist within your society. Chambers of Commerce, United Way, community hubs, local neighborhood organization. This is an example of bridging social capital, where you have the United Way actually has a foot in and is representing quite a number of different organizations, because in a lot of cities that are facing a lot of big city urban questions, you have a number of really small but critically important groups that serve marginalized populations. So you may have 3 individuals that serve hot coffee to the unhoused on the street. They're not big enough, and they're too busy to have a public advocacy arm and a public advocacy role. So what they do is they're a member in something like the United Way or a community hub, excuse me, that represents on their behalf. So you may not need to reach out to the coffee van, but you need to reach out to the United Way to represent and get access to them. And then the third step of the mapping societal institutions process is looking at the sectors. And like I showed on the last slide, identifying a sector, and then identifying the presence in the community. At this point, the exercise is to identify who's here and who's not here. And now which sector goes first obviously is dependent on your society, obviously depends what is the most important to your culture, your organization, what you're interested in achieving in the short term. But you have a methodology by following this to help identify the players that are on the ground. And now this is blurred out intentionally because it's not a map of a society sector. But if you can imagine, this was the map of the faith sector in Calgary, Alberta. So the thicker dots are faith organizations that have a higher density of the population. And when you could imagine each one of those 15 sectors represented in a map like this, where each actor within the sector is represented by a dot representing their size and their density, and then all of the lines, the intersecting lines, represent their connection to all of the other organizations within their own bonded social capital, and then bridged across to other organizations. Now, if you can imagine, that network map exists for each sector in your society. If we then take it up and we now combine all of your network maps that exist in your society, you start to understand, and these are 2 examples of how to represent it, you start to understand that the society you serve is a fully functioning, connected set of networks, that without you as an emergency manager or involved on the corporate side either, without you doing anything, all of these problems are being solved, discussions are happening, collaborations occurring, cooperations occurring, relationships are being built, social capital is being formed. This is an active, ongoing network. The reason we argue that this is important, that I believe it's important, is often we find a struggle with emergency managers is trying to build new networks. I'm trying to build relationships with the community, and I don't know where to start, or I don't know who to begin. I don't know what to say. I don't know how to build. This strategy gives you a visualization and a definition of the networks that exist. So you're not in the business of establishing new networks. You're in the business of establishing connections to existing networks, ones that you don't have to create. And the result of all of this is you get to identify key leadership, where these nodes intersect. So where the planes intersect, or sorry, where the different sectors intersect, you start to notice that membership is held in 2 organizations. By default, because I hold membership in a number of different organizations, there's a reasonable assumption that there's a level of trust there by the fact that I'm a member of several different organizations. But the key, and I think the interesting find of our research is it's not by position. The logic would tell us that it's the CEO that's the best connected and it's the top of the organization. But our research, when we come back, realize no, it's in fact, it may be your IT individual, or it may be your head of HR, or it may be the person on the delivery door of the warehouse that talks to everybody who comes and goes from your operation is actually has strong connections, a series of networks. This is an iterative process. It is ongoing, it is longitudinal, and it's not something that you're going to solve overnight, but it's a way of identifying I have a limited period of time, a limited amount of energy. I need to build relationships. How do I know who to talk to in my community? This is a methodology that we're developing that can answer that question for you. But what's an engagement strategy? Well, engagement can't really occur until you've identified the key leadership. Again, like I just said, how do you figure out who to engage to and who holds trusted positions within your society? It's policymakers and institutions. So people, whether you sit on the public sector side of emergency management or whether you sit on a business continuity, private sector side, whether you might be the head of emergency management for a post-secondary institution, you are responsible for setting up the enabling environment, setting the conditions to foster social capital. It is your responsibility to create the space where people collide, where people get to meet and people get to come together. You build a stock of social capital to influence the sources of other social capital. And the example is I wouldn't loan my shovel to you at my front door if I didn't know who you were. That relationship you and I build first, that small sense of trust, that sense of acknowledgement that we know each other and we both belong in this neighborhood and we have a common sense of place, that's required before the flows of other capital occur. So before human capital, education, information, financial capital, physical capital, and goods start flowing along connected lines, we first have to establish those bonds with human beings. That's building a stock of social capital and letting it flow. And that increases a sense of cooperation, goodwill, and solidarity amongst your population. Again, and the end result of what we're trying to achieve here is setting up pathways for preparedness and risk communications to travel, again, along a set of trusted pathways that are healthy, ongoing, and already established in the population. And the brilliance of this is you start getting key leadership seeking out you as an emergency manager for information, for discussions, for points of interest, instead of a fire and forget mentality. Send out your preparedness communications, send out your blurbs, and hope somebody is listening. And so what is the outcome we're looking for out of all of this? It's a trusted distribution channel that increases the likelihood of message reception and behavioral adoption. Because in the end, however you define that prepared individual, if you're going to issue a preparedness message, it hopefully is designed to increase a gap that you've identified. And if nobody is currently listening through the methodology that's being used now, maybe establishing a new trusted distribution channel will increase that likelihood. And I think just a brilliant benefit to this is creating a two-way communication street to the served community. You get the ability to send messages out, but what's really incredible is you get needs start coming in. The population starts identifying what they need from emergency management, or even better, and I find that this is a bit off-putting within the emergency management field, is should the community set the priority for the EOC, or should it be the EOC that sets the priority for the community? We can debate that. Love to have a great discussion about that. But if you have a set of priorities on your wall in your EOC, Have you bothered to ask the community whether that's correct or not? And I'll give you a prime example. In southwestern Ontario, I was doing some research in 2022, and they had the list in their EOC of the top things. Saving lives, nobody argues with that. But getting the power on. But in fact, what from the population's perspective, their number one interest was to get mobility. They wanted the routes cleared. They wanted to be able to drive around and connect with their distributed families and to the different locations long before the city would put any effort to get the power back. So the city, or the regional municipality, I should say, was working diligently and overnight to at a number one priority that did not represent the priority of the community. So all of this hard work was done not to achieve what the community thought was the number one thing to do. You may or may not change your plan, but I would say that an informed plan would be excellent. And this figure on the left here is from a emergency operations center in southwestern Ontario. And basically, it is a figurine showing that they understand the value of social capital. They understand the value of connectedness. The person you see on that you can't see on the other side is representative of the community. These are all the first responders and the civilian elected officials and the community getting together. And this is in the middle of their decision table where the mayor and the key leadership make impactful decisions in times of crisis. So this is something that they had made and put there. And I think that speaks eloquently to what we're trying to achieve. And just before I hop over, there you go. Just before I hop over to questions, I just want to reiterate what we're trying to generate here in the special interest group is to create that space where I have an idea like this, I get an opportunity to present it, we get a significant amount of time to debate it and to discuss it, and that this is something that happens quite regularly, and that we do that in the special interest group in Mighty Networks, that stuff is put up there. People put ideas back and forth. If you're trying to solve an issue, trying to address a problem, it's a space where we can all get together, because right now we don't have that space where the emergency manager of a major Canadian city can sit around a virtual conversation table with two academics and two researchers to help address a problem. They're smart. They just don't have the horsepower to do the work to address the problem. So I think it's a great opportunity for all of us to work together. And with that, I'm going to unshare my screen, and then we're going to, I can't see the chat there. It'd take me a bit to read through there. If you want to just see if there's any questions in the chat that pop up there, Tristan.
I don't think there's any questions in there just yet, Jeff. So perhaps what we'll do is, if you'd like to raise your hand, we can call on you and you can ask a question or perhaps make a comment. Or alternatively, if you like, you could post something in the chat and we could read it out on your behalf and answer and discuss whatever the question or the topic is that you have of interest. So yeah, we really want to hear from you. And Jeff's presentation was fascinating, included a lot of really great ideas. I think for me, when I'm listening to Jeff speak, it makes perfect sense, and I'd love everyone to understand the same kinds of ideas. You know, it's clearly so important, social capital and connections, the way that it facilitates getting things done. You know, it's difficult to do anything with physical capital or human capital or anything else if you don't have social capital. And we need to be able to communicate that to people, and we need to perhaps change some of the ways that we do things to prioritize this really important way of doing things. So yeah, feel free to post your questions or put your hand up. There should be under the reactions tab in Zoom. You can raise your hand there.
And I'll just while we're waiting for the first person to break the ice, I'll quote an emergency manager, and then I'll get to your question there, Sandra. Just give me one sec there. And I just want to that said, he told me once that if he spent more than 50% of his time in his office, he was not doing his job. That 50% of his job in a city was to be out in the population, meeting the population, spending time with the population. And that's something that I've taken to heart and followed up. So Sandra, we'll turn over the first question to you, and then we'll go to Janet and then Ben.
Well, I I have one question. Okay, Jeff, can you tell me the objective of this research is to build a methodology, right?
Yes, to build an operationalization strategy. So something that somebody on the ground can execute and follow.
Okay, well, let me tell you that I made and I present to the social capital organization about 2021. And I made a research that I apply here in the metropolitan zone of Guadalajara. And I include the most important. There exist 22 factors to create collaboration. And then I apply here, I apply about 299 survey, electronic survey, and we identify 7 dimensions that have to exist, 7 dimensions that have to exist to build this collaboration. This is focusing to build social capital.
Yeah.
Then I built that I call collaboration nodes between enterprises, because I live here in Mexico and we can weigh the institution incentive to build social capital. And that is the reason that we have doing research. And the last semester, we create a new methodology to build those leaders that you told us that we have to identify, but we have to create them. And then we ask here in metropolitan zone of Guadalajara and Mexico City too, we apply for students and that we believe that maybe they are more capable to be open to the change, because we are living here in Mexico, well, that we call the collective unconsciousness, okay? The culture and many other practices that pulls to you, and they don't work very good. Then we apply this market research, and we get that the young people and the CEOs of enterprises, they want to become a change maker, or they are interested in the training to become a change maker.
Yeah.
And since January, we are incentive that we call the 7 change, because we found that exist related with the 7 dimension, but we addition in this methodology, the personal development and the sustainable impact. And we know how can we identify in groups by a correlation matrix. How can we identify the main problems of the group and to work on these problems? And we put goals and objectives, missions, and we build a strategy to build the social capital. I don't know.
And
I
think
could
that's
be work.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of common between what you and I are saying about creating that the conditions to foster the social capital, and that the point that I was making earlier about the people in key positions have to take that step. Somebody has to set up the enabling environment. Somebody has to be that person who says, I not only want to create better bonds with people, but somebody has to step over that line Just like, the first person has to put their hand up to ask a question, somebody has to step over the line and say, I'm going to be the one who's going to set up that collaborative space. And then I'm going to use either my methodology or your methodology for identifying those key players that we want to bring. I think that's common. If you're okay leaving it there, I just want to hop on to Janet and Ben's spot there, if that's okay.
Well, I think that maybe it could work if it's useful, the research that we made and the results that we obtain, well, maybe we can join our research and maybe we can, build a stronger methodology, that we have now.
Yeah, absolutely. I look for it because that's exactly what we're trying to do inside the special interest group over on Mighty Networks, is create that space where you can put links up to the research you're doing. I can put links up to the research I'm doing, and then we can kind of collaborate and work on it that way. I think it's a great opportunity. Janet, we'll go over to you for your question.
Hello, can you hear me?
Absolutely.
I can't seem to make the video work. I have poor internet, so that might be why. Hello, I'm coming from the practitioner space. I am an unpaid volunteer with the CFA, the Country Fire Authority in Victoria, Australia. And we have positions called community safety coordinators devolved at each local volunteer brigade. And I have a passion in this space. My background's working with community groups, not-for-profit sector. So I hoped I could bring my expertise. What I observe from the CFA is we've had significant royal commissions. We're one of the most high fire risk areas in the world for bushfire. Yeah. And where I live is within Victoria, one of the most high-risk areas within that. So it's very real. It's not theoretical. And two different things. One is the CFA, after royal commissions and all sorts of reflection, moved to a big organisational change about saying we have to move with the community, not a command and direct model. And so they made these positions, but it's a big creaking organisation to make move. So a couple of things have happened. They started off moving to, I believe, a community engagement social capital model. What happened then was that people couldn't see measurable results. So in the last couple of years, they've moved to a person-centred model. So back to an individual about what their needs or risks, and they're experts in their own life. I'm concerned they're still not placing it or understanding the value of social capital. So what's happening is I would like to understand within my role, I'm all up for helping people with significant challenges to manage their own circumstances and collect appropriate timely information so they can make powerful decisions. But I would like to situate that in the broader context of the community. So what I'm trying to think about is, okay, I will do your models and training about how it is I'm going to work with individuals, but I want to then go talk to, say, carer groups of people with different illnesses, try to go back out again to a step that is another community, so that perhaps you can find a way that people aren't isolated because, say, for example, they have complex health needs. And so I suppose what I'm trying to say is, are there bridges or work or thought out there about how it is I can bridge from having moved to this person-centred model to connecting it back to social capital in effective ways? And if you can point me in the direction of anything to read or people with models or something, that would be great. And then my other thing from that quickly is what I find within there's probably other CFA people who've been involved in your group, but I'm going to speak a little bit out of school here. They think that my social capital is theirs to be spent. So what that happened there is, I'm a member of a community. I've worked on relationships. They were looking at doing a community-based model, but what they did is they planned for 3 months over in our head office in another place and didn't come talk to any of us stakeholders, and then came in and said, oh, now we want you to put this stuff out. And I said, I don't wish to call in my networks of people and spend my social capital on something I don't feel trustful is actually about really listening to them and engaging, because you've not modeled that in any way up till now. So I ended up withdrawing from that process because I was not trustful. And I think for myself, I saw I'm in this for decades. I don't want to be your tick in a box for a week and you then burn everyone in my community. So anyway, if you've that's something I see, that people think this is a shorthand to getting to people, inverted commas, to tell them what they should do.
And I think that that's true. And when you talk about, I talk about a lot in some of my writings as I talk about it as the unit of measure. Right now, our preparedness communications talk to the individual instead of the community, right? We're trying to make individuals prepared. We're trying to make families prepared. We're not trying to make communities resilient, because one does not, I would argue, lead to the other. So what we're trying to encourage here is that you have to look inward from your community. Somebody has to be that setting the conditions to create that social capital within your community, and identifying inward what your community needs, and then getting those services from the higher. And when you talk about access, I hear a lot of that, not just from you, but from a lot of conversations that I have. And it's old school of, first we need to build the relationship, then we need to build the trust, and then you can come ask for my stuff. It's kind of along that set of lines. And historically, humanity has always been that way, in that if you're an emergency manager and you want to build relationships with the community, you have to build relationships. You don't show up with a cute crest on your shirt and start telling people what to do in an emergency, because they don't know who you are. You haven't built institutional trust. Now, as for any specific models, nothing off the top of my head, to be honest with you. I've got a note here. I will go look into it. And then if you want to join us over on the special interest group, I'll throw something on there in the next couple of days to see what I can find to answer that question, to see if there's any specific resources to help you along that point.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your assistance, and I really have valued the discussion.
Perfect. Yeah, it's great. Fabulous. Thanks for being here. Then we're going to go to Ben and then Scott.
Hey, Dr. Donaldson. Hopefully you can hear me okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. So as always, awesome presentation, very insightful, very much enjoyed it. And I think my question is a bit of an extension of Janet's question and Paul's question in the chat. So you may have already kind of spoken to this a bit, but I think one of our challenges is we're trying to build some of that community trust in the community. And then our goal is to have then actually incorporate the community into our emergency responses and have them be a leg of our EOC. And we have done this a bit in the past, but what we've found is that when we've tried to do this, there's just so many community networks and so many community organizations who are all so strong and doing such good work, and that we actually become, as the organization, the weak link, because we're not inherently kind of adaptable and can pivot as easily and quickly as some of these community-based organizations can, just with our inherent bureaucracy. So I guess my question is, if you have any inputs or insight into how we can maybe reduce some of that bureaucracy, or if we even are some of the best ones to facilitate some of those conversations. And then if you've seen this been done effectively, I know Janet kind of already asked that, but if you've seen any examples of communities that have dealt with some of these bureaucracy challenges and incorporated the communities into their emergency operations effectively.
So the answer to that is yes. It has been done periodically where it has worked reasonably well. And the challenge is it's a bit of an ideological shift for people in emergency management who are used to hierarchical organizations. And I spoke to Public Safety Canada and at Devolution, when I was on Devolution, I spoke about that if we think about response, we step away from preparedness for a bit and we think about response. There are 4 responses that happen in a community. There's the public sector, the private sector, there's the civil society, and the nonprofit. All 4 of them are responding to the event. Emergency management within the city believes they are the response, and it's everybody else's responsibility to fall under their direction and to follow under them. It's Now, public sector has a legislative mandated responsibility to respond, and we're not getting away from that. What we're suggesting is an ideological switch. So the conversation from the emergency management is, how can we support your response? We're not here to direct the community's response. We're not here to tell the community where to go or what to do or where the need is. We're here to say, what of our public sector resources would you like to use or have at your disposal for your community response? That is an ideological switch that is awfully hard for a number of people that come to EOCs from hierarchical first response backgrounds, right? You know, a former police officer that runs an EOC is not used to asking an outside organization how they can hand over resources to support them. They're more in a direction orientated. I'm the city of Calgary. I'm responding to an emergency, a flood of the Bow River. Everybody has to listen to me because I am the response. I think we cross that barrier when we change the conversation to there are 4 responses and we need to coordinate and cooperate. We don't need to command and control. And this is what everybody thought was funny, as an ex-Army guy talking about getting rid of command and control. But I think we would do a lot better if we tried that. If we tried more coordination, instead of you telling the community where the response is going to happen, asking them how you can help them. That's the best suggestion that I have right now. And it's an ideological shift. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Thanks for that, Dr. Donaldson. As you know, I always enjoy hearing you speak, and be happy to connect sometime and chat with you more on some of the stuff we're doing. So thanks again.
Absolutely, Ben. No problem. Scott, what can I do for you?
Well, I don't know if I have a question. It was more of of an observation. Great presentation, by the way, Jeff. And so, as I was listening to Ben speak, I'm reminded of some of the social development work that we do, and we often talk about, whose table this is. And I think as you've just said, we've always assumed that the table is emergency managers' tables. But in our conversations with local chambers of commerce, they have just as much skin in the game and interest and desire because it's their community. So they want to be part of this. So if we stop thinking about it as our table and think of it as a shared table, and you're making a contribution to that shared table, and your contribution is different and unique as an emergency management organization than the business sector or the community sector. But if you think of it as a shared table, then you've already shifted the dynamic. And so then you're working at inviting people to be part of something as opposed to telling them that they should or asking them for something when you need it and you haven't already built the relationship. So, if we stop thinking about emergency management as our table because it's our responsibility, that may be true, but think about it as a shared table. What are you bringing to the table and what do you need from that table?
And I think that last point.
Is there a question in there? I don't know.
There is, because I think when you said, what's the need from the table? And that's what I said, highlighted in the presentation, is that you get a message out through this trusted pathway, but you might just magically start getting needs in. And emergency managers, and I keep coming back to the fact they're fantastic people, but they are incredibly short staff. They don't have a lot of energy, so they don't have a huge amount of time to be out in the population all the time, talking to everybody and assessing the needs. But if you can create those pathways where I'm not here to dictate to you, I'm not here to tell you what to do, I'm not here to hand you the 5,000 pamphlets every week at Emergency Preparedness Week, I'm actually interested in how I can help set you up for success the next time we go down this road, like the pandemic. The handling of PPE, the handling of the bylaws, the enforcement of the rules. The corporate Canada will tell you that was one of the worst disasters I think Canada has ever had from just that perspective. But have we built that relationship any better since then? I don't know if we have.
Well,
I love the
I
shared
think
table idea, though.
yeah, when you go out and talk to the business community, you really just need to ask them one simple question. If something happens in our community, which side of the yellow tape do you want to be on? Do you want to be
Yeah.
evacuated or you want to be on the inside helping out? And
Yep.
99% of them are going to say, you know what? I would much rather be inside using whatever resources I have as a business to help my community than be standing on the outside watching somebody else being brought in.
Yeah, and I'll just point this out, and then we're going to go to some questions from the chat. If you look at the response and in Yellowknife to the fires this summer, those fire breaks were built by the private sector, working in coordination and cooperation with the local emergency management. It wasn't the government that built the fire breaks. It wasn't the government's equipment. It wasn't the government's employees. It was the private sector that did it. And it wasn't under the direction of emergency management. It was cooperating with emergency management. And if you ever get a chance, Cabin Radio is the radio station up there. They've got a massive amount of wonderful stuff to that. Tristan, do you tracking the questions in the chat? Sorry, I lose that. And then I'll go to you, Timothy, after these questions.
Catherine was next in the chat. If you want to scroll back up a bit. How important is linking social capital at the municipal level?
Catherine, thank you very much. I would tell you right now that Professor Aldrich would say it's probably one of the key factors to successful post-event outcomes. If you look at, it's one of the key identifiable variables. When we look at common events that have happened now, a lot of Professor Aldrich's work has been done in major disasters that happen in Japan. So you have a community that has the same event happen to them and a common damage. But why does one community do better? Why do they have better post-event outcomes? And people's first default is because they're wealthy. It's actually not the wealthy who bounce back better and faster. It's the better connected. It is the strength of the linking social capital between the local municipal government and the emergency management, but mainly the government and the people and the voice of the population. The strength of that relationship is directly correlated to the quality of post-event outcome, right? So we know, whether we agree with it or not, well-connected and strong communities get a disproportionate amount of resources in response and recovery. We would like to say it's idealistically divided, but the research tells us that's not true. So linking social capital, very, very important. That's what you're building when you're the city emergency manager outside of Toronto, and you're spending your time outside of the office building those relationships with the community you serve. You get those needs, you understand those, so that the limited time and space you have to respond, you're executing tasks that your community is looking for. And that's based upon this linking social capital. That very much, absolutely. I think I covered that one. I think that's what that covers that, Tristan. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think so. The next one was from Paul Cull. He asks, he strongly agrees with the two-way communication between community networks and the EOC. Do you have any recommended mechanisms or structures that can facilitate that connection into an activated EOC?
So as just to amplify what Scott put in there about Emergency Management Logistics Canada, that platform address is a great example. The key, and I think the foundation to that and everything that we're talking about today, is building strong social bonds in times of peace and calm, right? So that when the EOC is activated, when an event occurs, when chaos starts to reign, you already have those connections built. You already have those relationships established, not just in the sense that I know who I need to call when I need a certain resource, but that I'm comfortable reaching as a representative of a community organization. I'm comfortable reaching in to an activated EOC because I've already built the relationship with that organization, with the people in there. They know who I am. they will answer the phone and they will pay attention to me. And that goes a lot further. And I keep using an example that came up during the height of the COVID in 2021, where there was a rooming house, and a whole rooming house full of the unhoused got COVID. And you could just a series of problems with that. And the big issue is that they needed to feed them. So the city was going to go out and contract a feeding mechanism with a local sandwich shop, except right next door was a United Church. And I'm going to date myself, but the United Church Ladies Association in 30 minutes or less can whip up food for over 100 people, right? They were ready. They were willing to help, but there was no pre-established connection between the emergency manager and these community organizations. The emergency manager didn't know that the community was ready, willing, and able to jump into action to feed the people in need, instead of having to reach out and try to tender a contract to get subs made. And that's just an example of how that really works well when you build those relationships. As Tim Little will like the FEMA comment of blue sky planning, right? Of doing things when it's peace and calm. Did we have any other questions from the chat?
Yeah, there is another one before we get to Tim.
Okay.
And I think that really highlights too, Jeff, the point that there's a lot that goes into building relationships that we often don't talk about. We talk about, getting someone's phone number, getting their business card, being able to contact them, simply knowing who they are. But you've just highlighted how it's more than that, because when you build a relationship with somebody, you then know about them and what they do and what they want to do and are willing to do. And it's all of those aspects of knowing that end up being the greatest opportunities. Because if you don't know about them, then just simply knowing them isn't really enough to be able to activate the kinds of social capital benefits and outcomes that we're interested in.
And I think that's a really important point, because what often happens in emergency management, in the logistics section specifically, is they get a list of contacts. And that's the extent of the public sector or the engagement with the population. They go, I need kitchens. Here's a list of people who have kitchens, and they stop there. And then once a year, they have an activation exercise where they go through the old-fashioned Rolodex and call everybody to see if they're still out there. And we're arguing that there's a lot more, like you said, there's a lot more to it than that to be beneficial.
I'd be really interested if anybody has a way to describe this, because the only term that I use is knowing. Knowing about them, knowing what they do. It's all about knowing. But perhaps there's another way to talk about that. But
Familiarity.
Anyhow, yeah, perhaps. There was a question from David Rose in the chat, who unfortunately has had to leave, but perhaps you could answer it anyway, so that he can watch the recording and catch up on it later. He asks, do you see community consultation on priorities being important also during the response phase of an emergency, or is it best leveraged in the recovery phase?
I think it's best done in the preparedness phase. I think it's best done in pre-event. Finding them out in the response phase is challenging and difficult, because that's when the needs rise up, right? Finding them out at that time. In the recovery phase, it's helpful. And I think if what he's leaning towards is, are these relationships best leveraged in response or in recovery? I would say that's depending on what other forms of capital exist in the relationship. So if social capital is the glue that holds society together and the lubricant that allows the flow of other forms of capital, some forms of capital are more beneficial in the response phase. Some forms of capital are more beneficial in the recovery phase. But what I'm arguing is that all of that is facilitated by building strong social capital in the preparedness phase, I think, is the best way to paraphrase that. And community consultations on priorities is very much like the sectorial mapping that I went over. It's an iterative process, right? Because societies, as we define them, will change. Our social capital will change. It's moving. Relationships will increase. Relationships will falter. They'll strengthen. They'll weaken. And so this is an iterative process that we have to keep going. So if I know Ben and I know Scott and I know Tim, if I really want to have a relationship with them, I just have to keep that relationship going. I have to keep the conversation. I have to talk about what they're up to, because by knowing what they're up to, like you said, Tristan, then I get access to knowing, or familiarity, or whatever we can come up with. The better way of describing that is getting to understand everything, all their capitals and their stock of that may be available.
So Tim's next, and then we still have a question in the chat from Kiyomi after that.
Okay, Tim, go ahead.
Hey, good evening. Thank you so much, y'all. This is a great conversation, and man, ooh, lots to digest. But unfortunately, one of the things that we really do observe and because we're in it, is that folks don't really get interested in knowing who their neighbor is, nor do they get interested in necessarily connecting with the right agency that might have that resource that they need until after a disaster. And a lot of this, as much as I agree with you that it should be happening in preparedness, it happens in recovery. And I was really curious, and I apologize for being ignorant. But in the States, we've got there's a role, we call it a VAL, Voluntary Agency Liaison, who works with the National VOAD and the community, and the VOAD being the Voluntary Organizations Active in Disaster. They'll work with those with the VOAD model, connecting at the local level with different organizations, and they will travel around a county or a community, trying to drum up support to create a long-term recovery group generally to address unmet needs. And I'm curious if, and generally, like from the Fed perspective, and from sometimes some of the states have these folks doing this as well at the state emergency management agency. I'm curious if that kind of position exists in, say, Canada. Just curious. That's mostly my question is how is that being addressed from the federal level in Canada or in other other nations? I'm just really curious. I'm not saying we have the best model, but we're trying to leverage that unknown social capital, and trying to get people talking to each other. Over.
Yeah, and I think thanks for the question, Tim. And part of this is a big governance question in emergency management here in Canada is different. We don't like our federal emergency management folks don't have a response role. There is a disaster funding role that comes in recovery to help with funds related to recovery, but that's not a response is not a federal role. Now there may be some federal assets that the provinces have to request if they're looking for it, but the provinces are the top level of emergency management governance in Canada. So it would be like the United States of America. There's FEMA would hand out money and would call the Army to get some Army troops to help out, but FEMA itself, its mirrored image in Canada, doesn't have any governance responsibility over emergency management. So each individual province then, here, let's make it more complicated, is constructed differently on their own models. There's no one common structural model for emergency management across Canada. So the position that you refer to in the province of Ontario, for example, there's a position called a Community Emergency Management Coordinator in each of the 444 municipalities, who is supposed to be that liaison individual. A lot of times that individual is doing this part-time. 5% of their work year has something to do with emergency management. And in some bigger cities, it can be a full-time responsibility. So is it done? Yes. Is it done in a dedicated formal sense identically across the country? No. When I've compared systems in British Columbia, Ontario, and Alberta, it's not that one is failing or it's not one that weaker than the other. They just allocate that task differently between their different governance structures. So I wish I could give you a very simple, direct answer that this is how it's done in this organization. You would have to look to depending on, you would have to say, how is it done in Ontario? And I know, for example, one of the individuals on this call, Jim Montgomery, he's a lifetime expert in that and runs an organization that does help in that around Canada in that kind of executing the response and liaison with the community. But as in a formalized structural role, no, because we don't have a system that mirrors what you do in the US. So like our federal government could, but generally doesn't deploy assets to help with a disaster recovery. Jim, you want to jump in? Feel free.
Yeah, yeah. Trying to raise my hand on the virtually, but I couldn't find it. Probably sorry. Probably the easiest way, Tim, is to explain it, and yeah, absolutely right. Is we don't depend on the feds or the states, provinces for assistance that way, other than a liaison person. Where we actually go is non-governmental organizations across the country, depending again exactly what Jeff was saying, depending where you live, but you're probably exposed to about 17 different groups. And that includes things like the Red Cross, Salvation Army, faith-based organizations, etc. But that's where a lot of the municipalities, those 400, especially in Ontario here, the 444 municipalities rely on those non-governmental organizations. That really is the capacity building, unfortunately, in Canada, where we get our capacity in order to respond. And really that, and Jeff, you're bang on, is that social capital, unfortunately, in Canada, it really does come from those non-governmental organizations. So what we see across Canada in each province, equal to a state, is what you see is non-governmental organization associations where they actually do the outreach to those communities to say, how can we help?
Yeah,
Wow.
thanks for
Well,
that,
thank
Jim.
you. That's just eye-opening. And I guess maybe we're lucky in that is something that, at least the way we're working, at least in talking about voluntary organizations, that we have somebody, from the federal level whose job it is, after disaster to go in and start having those conversations. Just kind of surprised. Thank you.
Oh, no problem, Tim. Any time. What was the other question that's in the, you said it was in the chat, Tristan?
Yeah, Guillaume asks, are there any suggestions on how to use social capital for climate justice? And I think she's talking about climate adaptation, particularly, and the way in which perhaps vulnerable communities might be impacted adversely or disproportionately by climate change. And so it seems like it's a central topic to disaster preparedness and dealing with climate change. Yeah, so any specific thoughts on that, Jeff?
Absolutely, and I think it speaks to the needs piece and understanding the additional risks that certain organizations are certain individuals, you can even call it socioeconomic groups, are exposed to as a result of a set of hazards. Like I often will say in my podcast, and I'll throw my my dig in there for my podcast that just hit 250 episodes after 4 years. Thank you very much. But that you make a choice where you live, and by choosing to live where you do, you accept a host of risks associated with that. Except that's very easy for me to say because I have the ability to be mobile. There are certain sectors of the population who, for one reason or another, don't have the ability to be mobile and can't avoid the risks that they inherit from where they live. And some of those may be related to climate. The difficulty with climate, and this is stepping around a minefield, and I'm perfectly happy wandering around in the minefield, is, are we talking about climate adaptation, or are we trying to talk about changing behaviors to try to fight climate change? And the reason I say that is the conference that Scott Cameron, who's on this call as well, him and I are both on the governing body for the Canadian Emergency Preparedness and Climate Adaptation Conference that's happening in September. And it's talking about what we can do to adapt to the changing climate, understanding that these impacts are coming and that our struggle is not in fighting climate change to try to stop the impacts from happening, but how do we going to choose to, what decisions are we going to make to mitigate and understand that these adaptations are going to be necessary anyhow? It's kind of a bit of a minefield. So yes, we need to have these conversations. And I think it comes from the same space of building that social capital trust with all the sectors of our society and understanding what their needs are and understanding what the risks they're exposed to is important. But I think we run into trouble when we frame it in an ideological frame that it's about fighting climate change. Like we're here to stop the climate change instead of adapting to the increased risk or the changing risk profile that will come as a result of the change of climate change and the change in weather patterns, for example, increased heat, more droughts, those type of things are going to impact how people live in the urban environment. The heat island effect and a bunch of other things are going to be exacerbated by that. So how do we adapt to that? There's a lot we can do, but I think it goes all back to the beginning of this presentation. You have to build the relationships with the affected population. And I don't know that we do a very good job of that.
Sorry, go ahead, Jeff.
I was just going to say, because a lot of times hierarchical organizations don't have positive relationships with some of the marginalized population.
Exactly. And that's what I was going to say as well, is I think it's pretty clear how we shouldn't use social capital, which is to say that, well, all communities need to do is they need to come together on their own and they need to leverage their own resources to get things done, because that's really just passing the responsibility and the blame onto those already marginalized and disadvantaged communities who are going to be most adversely impacted by climate change. And so that's not how to use social capital as a concept to be able to improve the outcomes when it comes to climate adaptation. So there is a question in the chat from Michael. He says, we work in the disaster relief space and have just received our first major grant, although we have become the go-to for disaster relief here in Australia. What would be some lessons learned for upscaling when it comes to non-profit to government relationship building and cohesion?
Okay, so I don't want to sound motherhood, but it's first establishing the relationship. And it's kind of an extension of what Scott said about a shared table and emergency social services. And all of the partners and the players that are going to have a voice when an emergency happens. Everybody who's going to show up, everybody's going to have a voice. And to extend again what Scott said about the private sector being involved in the table, it's first identifying, whether you use sectorial analysis or some other methodology, to identify all of the players who you would like to have around this shared table to build that relationship, so that you know when it's time to scale up. When we have a response operation, who are we able to turn to? Who are we able to count upon? And like you said before, Tristan, about what are those embedded resources that when we get to quote unquote know somebody and become familiar with them, and we identify those embedded resources, we now know what's available in our community when it comes to upscale. And then I think the next step is when we know it's available and we can logically extend to what we think we'll need in a significant disruption, if there happens to be a gap there. And then if Michael is talking about, okay, we're going to respond, the extent of the community capability will take us to a certain point, but not past that. Now I have an identified need that I'm likely going to need an additional amount of a certain requirement. Where would I go for that? And having those conversations with the government in times of peace and calm prior to an event happening, I think is the type of shared table analysis I think that we need to be doing a far better job of talking through possible events. What I try to do, and I'll leave it at this, I try to leave it off of doing tabletop exercises, right? Because they're usually, unfortunately, one and done. Let's talk through an exercise and throw it away. It's about relationship. How would we do this? Who would we be involved in this? Where might we think we're limited in? Who can we go to the government? What might the government? And it takes time. You're absolutely right. The government takes time. It's not just the people in government. It's building these relationships. It's longitudinal. It's ongoing. It's not something that you're going to solve tomorrow when you call a bunch of people, but it's starting a process. I'll give an example of the Capital Regional District in Victoria, BC, has been running this group for about 7 or 8 years. And this is their shared table of NGO community organizations. They come around and they talk about important issues in the city, and it just happens to be run by the folks from emergency management, but they would never dare to put up a PowerPoint or anything along that lines. But after 7 or 8 years, they now have pretty much every voice from the community present. That's the type of aggressive patience that people have to be willing to do to get those relationships built. Sharon, go ahead.
Hello, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. So this is probably part comment, part question, and probably one of those big ones that I won't articulate well this late at night here. But so I've been, we've heard a lot of this discussion, at least in my end. Like I know within the emergency management community for quite a few years now. Like it started to kind of thread in, which is awesome, because when I first started, these comments weren't happening. It was all about command and control and hierarchy, right? So the shift has been great. What I'm finding though is that when we're talking in our own community, we're kind of almost like preaching to the converted, and I don't know what other term to use, but like we're talking to people who already kind of get it. And when I see emergency managers try to bring that to other groups, to government, to their municipal counterparts, whatever, and try to get the people who kind of pay the bills, run the show, so to speak, on board, there automatically is that fear, that we're loss of control, that and I've seen it both in operations and I've also seen it in the preparedness phase when we're actually trying to do stuff. So I guess it's a comment, but it's also is how do we like we kind of, most of us, not all of us, but a lot of us know the value of this social capital. And I'm lucky. I've been a social worker and an emergency manager all these years, so I've kind of been able to see from both sides the value of bringing all of that together. How do we convince, and I know that's a big question, but how do we start to chip away at that boulder of convincing the people that need to really support that change to get us there?
Well articulated. I know exactly what you mean. So you nailed it this time of night. Well done.
Thank you.
You have to demonstrate it. It's the only way that has worked in the past. Is you're not going to convince a politician the value of this unless you can prove to them, let's be honest, that these relationships make them more popular in the community, because unapologetically politicians need to get reelected. Let's be frank. So what I've seen work is when the relationships are built, when you imagine you inviting the penny pincher and the bureaucrat to a meeting, and they come in and there's 35 groups from their community that all know each other sitting in the room, and they're chatting about important issues, and they're looking at you going, what is this? This is social capital. This is why it's important. I think demonstrating is the best way to do it. To try to force somebody to just join a bunch of organizations, I mean, it's another meeting that should be an email. How many of those have we had, right? I mean, the point being is reaching out to the community, identifying through whatever methodology, mine or some other methodology, to identify your key leadership, building that relationship, having what I refer to as aggressive patience, to just understand that this will take a considerable amount of time. And then you're going to have something to demonstrate the value of it, because you're not spending any money. You're spending time, which again is your most valuable resource. Let's be frank. There's probably only one of you, maybe one and a half of you, if you're lucky, doing emergency management. But the time that you invest in this will be proof in the pudding when you start to see people. And where it really benefits is the power of social capital is the relationships that you're building with other people you're indirectly accessing their entire network, because they're going to tell their network about this really cool relationship that I just made, this great idea they have. And I coin it by, I need to talk to a lot of people by talking to few. So I'm going to find a few key leadership, and by default through them, they'll say, hey, listen, you know, next Thursday, you should come to this. This is worth your time. I'll have never met them, and in the room they come because of a positive relationship I made there. Long-winded to say, demonstrate. I don't know how you tell somebody that they have to do it, because they default to hierarchical. That's what they default to. Command and control. It's an emergency. I'm in charge. I want to look authoritarian. That's why every politician loves those emergency management jackets they get with their name mayor on the side and the crest, that when the balloon goes up, they get to put on in front of the microphone, right? They're just ear to ear grin and they're looking all stoic and serious. You're not going to win that order. You know what I mean, right? Like, so you just got to demonstrate the power of that. I think is the best that you can do.
Thank you so much. That's actually quite helpful for me, trying to, you know, bring it down to 1 or 2 steps that you can do. And I think because it's such a mind-blowing big thing, but that helps bring it down. Thank you.
Oh, and it's my pleasure. And that's what I'm trying to do with this, where we want to go with this special interest group, to try to, like you said, there's been a lot of noise about how to build connectedness within the community, but we need to translate that to operational ideas. How do we give the person on the ground who actually has this task, how do we give them a very clear set of steps that, based upon research, we know has a higher likelihood of a better outcome? So how do we researchers, call us nerds, whatever you want to, that's go off and study this stuff and run a bunch of surveys and ask a bunch of questions? The goal is, it's kind of pointless if we don't translate that to a practitioner on the ground. And this is the idea of the special interest group that we're trying to create here at ISCA. Is right now there isn't a place for somebody like yourself who's got the job to execute it, where you can pose a direct question to a group of people who also execute it and research it and teach it. What are we thinking? What are people saying? Is there any research being done on this? Why not try us instead of Google Scholar? That's what I'm trying to throw out there. That I think there's value here. And I think that the more people that join, the more value we have. The more events we have like this, where we get people on, and then we start, because I don't see another hand up, so I'm going to jump up and say that we have, and we're coming up on an hour and a half here anyhow, it's getting late in some places, that soon in the next week or so, I'm going to be putting some polls out in the Mighty Networks group about what you would like to see next, right? Because I can design a program, but what's the point of me designing a list of things for you to listen to? I think it would defeat the exact purpose of what I'm trying to say, is to go out to the community and say, hey, what are the ideas and the subject matter that you would love to see us discuss in a panel forum, in a presentation forum, in a open debate roundtable forum, however type of forum you prefer, and the subject matter, we're going to be putting that out so that people have a voice, so that the interest group is not just a place, but they talk about the things that you're interested in and the things that you would like to be involved in. Because otherwise, what's the point of your time, right? It's your most finite resource you have, is time. And if you're going to spend time here, it might as well be worth your value. So is anybody...
Well, yeah, just speaking a bit more about the interest group, like we really do want this to be, democratically run, everybody having a say, everyone getting involved and getting out of it what you want to get out of it. So currently Jeff is, I guess, the chair of the interest group, but we'd love to have a steering committee, a group of people who want to have an active role in seeing the direction for the interest group moving forward. We, want to hear from you about what you want to see happen, what sort of activities, what sort of facilities. We've got this fantastic Mighty Network space as a starting point, and within that space, there's the facility to create resources and shared documents and various other things that can support what we're doing. The discussion you've just been having about this is that it is really difficult to communicate the importance of these ideas to a paradigm that is very individualistic in its focus. And we continue to struggle with it, or maybe Jeff doesn't struggle with it. He's clearly got the words to be able to describe it. But, for the rest of us, it's difficult because you say, trust is important. And you see the blank sort of looks on people's face. Oh, yes, 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 trust is important. But they don't really get how important it is and why it's important and why it matters. And being able to put that into words, describe it. And I guess that is the power of the concept of social capital, is that it gives us that framework to be able to communicate, well, it's important because it's capital, it's important in these ways, and this is what it does, and it allows us to communicate it. And we're still pushing against the paradigm that's not particularly receptive to these ideas, but at least we've got some language to be able to use to start communicating in a strong and meaningful way. And this interest group we can all help each other to develop that language, develop these ideas about how we can communicate it, because we know it's important, but the existing paradigm perhaps doesn't appreciate it quite as much as they need to.
Absolutely. I mean, we will take this down whatever road that the population wants to go and discuss the subject matter that's important to the population. Does anybody have any last questions before I wish you a good evening, good afternoon? It's not a silly question, Paul. No.
I'm probably best to answer that one.
Yeah.
Is it possible to turn it off? Yes, absolutely it is. So you can find, if you go to your personal settings within Mighty Networks, you'll see a tab there. You'll see like account and edit profile. You'll see a tab there for notifications, and you can select your email updates. You can select the frequency, whether you receive a daily digest or not. And you can also, if you've got the mobile app, you can select to receive the push notifications as well. And then if you go even further down, you can even customize the notifications even further. So you can turn off and on comments and mentions and all that sort of stuff. So you can customize how often you get hassled by the network. And it is one of those balancing acts. To be able to stay connected, you need to receive some notifications, but you don't want to receive them all the time and get hassled by them. So Mighty Networks is pretty good for being able to customize what it is that you want. I don't believe there is an option for a weekly digest instead of daily. I believe it's daily or nothing, unfortunately. But you certainly can customize the types of notifications you receive.
And then if you only want to go in weekly, it's possible to just visit weekly and then you see the notifications as they are, as they exist. But depending on the activity level, that can be a pretty significant number of all at once notifications. But it has great ability, great customization, and it's a wonderful platform to be in there, because the one part that I like about it is we can share presentations, we can share documents, we can exchange all of these things and make them open forum. We can comment on each other's. It's a great space that differentiates the conversation outside of a Facebook forum. I think that's the huge benefit that we get in the Mighty Networks, and it creates a community where we're able to reach out to people in the community, just in the community, outside of the larger social capital association, or I should say inside the larger social capital association. All right, I think that's everything there, Tristan. I think I'm done. Do you have anything else to add before I close it off?
No, that's all. No, it's been a fantastic session.
All right, thanks everybody for taking the time out of your day. I wish you the best of luck, and please, if you wish, feel free to connect with me over on LinkedIn. It's Jeff Donaldson, PhD. Send me a request. I had a whole bunch this morning. I'd love to connect with you, and looking forward to meeting you all in the Mighty Networks. All right, take care. Have a good night.